We're here today to talk about self-love in youth, a topic that I'm very passionate about. It's really, really important. It's always important, especially kind of in the shadow of Valentine's Day, which, we talk a lot about love. We talk a lot about giving love on Valentine's Day. We talk less about self-love and care for our own well-being, generally, and even around Valentine's as well. So as I said, we're really excited to be here. We're really glad you all are here. I'm seeing a lot of people from around the country. That's awesome. So why don't I go ahead and get this started? We have 45 minutes. We're going to make the most of it. So I will introduce myself, and then I'll introduce our two other panelists here. So as I said, I am Dr. Naomi Torres-Mackie. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the head of research at the Mental Health Coalition, where we work to destigmatize mental health. We work to encourage conversation around mental health, and we work to connect people to much needed mental health resources. I'm also a Brooklyn-based clinical psychologist. I practice clinically at Lenox Hill Hospital with specializations in trauma, women's mental health, and perinatal health. I'm also an adjunct professor of psychology at Columbia University and co-founder of Nascent Consulting, which is a social justice and psychology-focused consultancy. I earned my doctorate from Columbia University, where I completed a dissertation on stigma management and strength construction. I'm also the author of the Psychology Today column, Underdog Psychology. So that's me. And then we have Dr. Anisha Patel-Dunn, also pronouns she, hers. And Dr. Patel-Dunn serves as the Executive Vice President of the Lifestance Health Foundation. She has nearly 20 years of experience as a practicing psychiatrist and managing a large group practice, having co-founded Pacific Coast Psychiatric Associates in 2006, which is now part of Lifestance. Dr. Patel-Dunn is also the Chief Medical Officer at Lifestance Health, where she oversees all clinical services delivered through Lifestance and ensures that care quality meets and exceeds professional standards. And Dr. Patel-Dunn holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Emory University and received her medical degree from the College of Osteopathic Medicine of the Pacific at Western University of Health Sciences. She completed her adult psychiatry residency at California Pacific Medical Center and is a board certified adult psychiatrist. Welcome. We have Aija Mayrock, pronouns she, hers. Aija is a best-selling author, poet, and performer. She started writing her first book, The Survival Guide to Bullying, when she was 16 years old after being bullied for many years. She self-published her book before it was acquired by Scholastic and published around the world. She has spoken to over 4 million people nationwide on bullying and mental health. And Aija was also named one of today's show's Heroes of the Year for 2018. She was also featured in the launch of the Mental Health Coalition's Every Day in May series with Katie Couric. And you can find that on the Mental Health Coalition's Instagram, along with our other one-to-one series. So welcome. Very, very glad to have you both here. Let's get started. Like I said, we have 45 minutes. We'll make the most of it. We have a lot of questions here about self-love. And I think it would be best if we just kick off by defining self-love. So I would love to start with you, Dr. Patel-Dunn. What is self-love and what is it not also? Because that's also very important.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. So I really, I think the way I perceive it, self-love is how we, not only how we perceive ourselves, but how we treat ourselves. How are we, kind, caring, compassionate towards ourselves as we think of, I always sort of think about child adolescent development and, having a sort of mother figure, good enough mother, and how much we get that unconditional love, compassion from our caretaker or caretakers. I think of that as how do we learn from that, or somehow, from others, not only just our caretakers, and how we treat ourselves. So really looking within and how we are compassionate, loving, caring towards ourselves.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's so well said, and it encompasses so much as you're speaking to. And to add to that, I just to get a sense too of like what self-love actually feels like. a really nice exercise. So this is, for the audience, but if you just picture somebody that you care for a lot, anybody in your life currently or in the past, you have really warm, loving feelings towards, you just picture that person in as much detail as you can and notice how you feel. And then if you direct those feelings back towards yourself, that's what self-love feels like too. And so I think that's really important as well in understanding like what it means and then also what it feels like. Yeah. And then so for you, Asia, what does self-love mean to you?
Well, first, I want to acknowledge I love what you just said. I think I never thought of self love in that way, and that's a really, really cool way to go about it. I think that to me, self love is a deep appreciation and acknowledgement for all aspects of yourself. I remember when I was going through my bullying experience, I really hated myself for so many years, for like much of my life at that point. And it was so hard for me to even find one little thing that I didn't hate about myself because I was so influenced by what everyone around me was saying about me at that time. And so I think that's something that I also used to practice, which is why I loved what you just shared, is I would find one little thing, like I liked my eyelash on my right eye. And every day I would try to get my little dose of self-love from this one little thing that I was okay with. And then I would look inwards and find that about who I was as a person as well, and just try to build on it every single day. So it was, it almost became a practice where I was incorporating these little moments where I was appreciating more of who I was in good moments and in bad moments. And that was something that helped me during that period. And I think is what I still look at as a good way to begin that journey if you're not quite there yet.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's something I also kind of preach in my clinical practice too, is when we're talking about self-esteem and self-love, what seed can you find that you can then grow? So that eyelash example is such a like nice, vivid example. I think that's really great. And when we talk about self-love, I feel like self-esteem inevitably comes up, and it's so tied to self-love. So I want to address that as well, and thinking about like how is self-esteem connected to self-love, and why is it so important?
For me, when I was going through bullying, I really lost all connection to my self-esteem because of what I was dealing with on a day-to-day basis, and because of that, I lost the sense that I, as a person, had any worth. And I think that that was a really, really devastating thing to happen at a young age. And I think it happens to so many young people, particularly with social media. And I saw a lack of worth within myself as a person, within the way I looked, within how I did well in school, like everything across the board. And it affected everything from my relationships with my family, my friends, to my schoolwork, to just honestly my mental health and where I saw my life could go. So I think it's directly connected and definitely impacts each other.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Asia. What about you, Dr. Patel-Dunn? I'm curious your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think that they are very directly related. And so when we think about, our self-esteem or how we value and perceive ourselves, and we talk about people that have low self-esteem, I think of, low self-love, right? That how we see ourselves through our own lens. And so in thinking about, you know, being compassionate and kind, and considerate for ourselves, like turned inward, I think of that as the higher the self-love, the more the self-love for one, the higher the self-esteem. I think that that's something that's very, very much correlated.
Sounds like self-esteem is kind of built on self-love in a way. Yeah, yeah, okay. Yeah, and so these ideas around self-compassion, self-love, self-worth, and self-esteem, I'm thinking, about individual experiences, and Asia, you've talked about those so in such a lovely, vulnerable, and brave way. And I'm also thinking on a broader scale about, lived experiences and how they connect to systemic, injustice and kind of these forces that impact self-love on a broad scale, right? So if you think about self-love on a systemic level, it makes me think about, the impact of sexism, the impact of racism, kind of the views of society that they have towards you, how they can impact your own view of yourself. And I wonder your thoughts, Dr. Patel-Dunn, on this, and kind of how can we conceptualize self-love on a broader scale? And then also kind of what can we do to foster self-love in youth in thinking about these systems that are very much at play?
Yeah, so I think I love how you say that, and just thinking about your world, right? So your nuclear family, then your friends and family, like extended, and then just sort of geographically, where you go to school or where you live or who you're connected with, and then just, our culture, right? And our culture in American culture, our culture varies depending on if you're in the city or in a more rural area. But if we think about our culture and how we perceive, how we're perceived. So for example, I think about, especially when I'm working with clients, just sort of thinking about how, even myself as a woman or as a daughter of immigrants, how I'm perceived or how my childhood was based on that compared to, say, somebody else. I think that it is so important for us as we think about youth, and I am very passionate about our youth here, especially the vulnerability as we're in a mental health crisis, right? The American Academy of Pediatrics and the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatrists both jointly came out and said, we're in a mental health crisis with our youth. And I think that where Asia, you mentioned social media. I do think this is where social media can be helpful, right? We've heard all about how it could be harmful, but if we think about how it can also be helpful, is that, for us to have people, speak up and recognize that I can have self-love for myself and be, maybe I didn't make the right decision, or sometimes I make the wrong decision, or maybe sometimes I've been hurtful or said something maybe unintentional that was perceived as hurtful. I can still be a good person. I can still be compassionate and loving, but can have kind of both sides of that, good and bad. And I do think that's where social media, really, I commend people that have come out, even in particular, struggling with mental health or mental illness issues, and just recognizing that, in the same way that we have good days and bad days, that we can be whole. We don't have to be all good or all bad. So meaning that we don't have to love ourselves fully every single day, but we can still treat ourselves compassionately and kindly with love.
Absolutely. I fully agree with you. Toxic positivity is in some ways just as harmful as direct criticism and insults. And when I think about kind of fostering self-love in youth, I think, as you're saying, like genuine support, genuine praise, rather than kind of constant all positive praise is important, because that, in society, kind of cultural standards around positivity and an emphasis on positive, if all you're giving is positive feedback, it can just ring hollow and end up being invalidating. And kind of going back to this idea of like systemic level forces and how these impact people, I think it's really important too to think critically about things that we often take for granted, right? Like beauty standards, for example, and how those are so white and Eurocentric in this country, and how those beauty standards impact an individual in terms of self-love and in terms of self-hate. And I think it's very important, for everybody to consider how these things play a role in self-love. And then also, how folks with more privilege can really think critically about what we take for granted, and how, we can empathize. If you can think of, experiences that allow you to genuinely empathize with folks that are, told that they're less than, even when they're not, and use that, to amplify voices, to challenge standards that exist that encourage self-hate in a very unjust way, and kind of embrace getting uncomfortable and addressing these things, I think is really important, especially when we're talking about youth and then how youth are affected and then, develop into adults. So all of that kind of considered, we've talked about social media a bit here and kind of touched on that. And I want to directly talk about social media too within this. And Aija, I know that's something that's really important to you and I think been an avenue of healing for you. So I'd love to hear from you, just your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think that social media is a bit of a double-edged sword. My first experience with social media was very negative. So I used to be bullied because I had a lisp and a stutter, and the bullying began with the way I spoke. I had some learning disabilities, and then it just kind of snowballed as I didn't speak up for myself, because I was bullied for the way I spoke, and just got worse and worse. But in the beginning, it was at school, it was confined while I was there, and then I went home. But as social media became, social currency, it went online. And when I was a freshman in high school, a girl I had never met who went to my old school dressed up as me for Halloween, wore a sign around her neck with my name on it, and posted it on Facebook. And suddenly I was getting death threats and hate comments from people I had never met before. And I was really experiencing mob mentality for the first time. So all of that to say, my initiation into social media was not a good experience. Then a few years later, I wrote my book, and I wrote my first book, The Survival Guide to Bullying, and that only was able to reach young people and help them because of social media. And I wound up getting my book deal because people saw it online. And so throughout the past few years, I have definitely gone back and forth on my mixed feelings around social media. But I do think, as it was mentioned, that there are a lot of enormous positives to social media. And I think a lot of young people can find things that they relate to, can seek comfort in, can find resources and even communities online that can help them with whatever they're struggling with, particularly if they are being bullied and dealing with a lot of self-hate and a lot of self-esteem issues. And that being said, I always say that I think it's really important to take time away from social media if you're feeling that it is affecting how you see yourself and how you feel about yourself. In my first book, I talk all about going dark or going semi-dark, which is basically taking a little break from social media or the specific platforms that might not be contributing well to a young person's everyday life. It's something I actually still do as an adult. But yeah, lots of feelings on social media. But I think that, obviously it can do a lot of good and not so good. And it just is all about how we choose to engage and create boundaries in our life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of this idea of like it's a tool, and it depends on how you actually use that tool, whether or not it's something that will end up dragging down your self-esteem and your self-love, or if it'll end up building these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of youth are on social media. Something like, I didn't even know the percentage, but high percentage of youth are on social media and regularly engage in it. So it's a really important space for youth. And when we're thinking about youth and self-love, I wonder, Dr. Patel-Dunn, this is more for you, but what's important? What are some red flags, some things that parents, peers, educators, other folks should be mindful of in thinking about, low self-love, low self-esteem in youth?
Yeah, so I think this is where what's so concerning to so many of us parents, have young daughters myself, I just thinking about what can be helpful. So low self-love, low self-esteem can really be quite impactful on our youth and cause depression, can be a precipitating factor, right, to cause depression. And so I think it's so important, just even some simple signs of, your youth. If your youth is acting out of character, that's something that I always like to highlight, because it's not necessarily always what we think of when someone is depressed or suffering from low self-esteem. Some people that are really kind of introverted may go the other direction, let's say, for an extreme example. So just recognizing that, especially for parents and caretakers, and this is where actually our teachers do such a great job, because they see our youth interacting, and sometimes even in a much more socially interactive environment, as opposed to at home, where you've got maybe even your teenagers that are stereotypical, in their room closing their doors. But I think of just anything out of character. I think sleep changes, sleeping a lot more or not sleeping, really just irritability, I think, also is one that, obviously depression, people think sad, tearful, of course, please recognize that, but just even the irritability or short fuse, oftentimes in our youth, just seeing that difference, or even simply like appetite changes too, if you're not having a lot of interaction with your youth, because they're shutting you out, maybe. Some of those real basic things that we think about can be manifestations of depression that are really part of so low self-love, low self-esteem.
Absolutely. And I'll add to that as a psychologist too, in thinking about daily mental health too, in youth who are grappling with low self-esteem, also like expressing that they feel unloved or unwanted, expressing they feel like they don't belong, feeling excluded, having difficulty making friends, fear of embarrassment, not putting as much effort. This is similar to what you were saying, Dr. Patel-Dunn, but not putting as much effort into schoolwork or things that they used to enjoy outside of school too. I think those are all really important signs as well. So yeah, and thank you. Those are really important to keep in mind as we're thinking about self-love. So now we have an idea of kind of what it can look like when self-love is really low and self-esteem is really low. So I'd love to move into talking more about what can we do as adults, both to model self-love and also help foster self-love in youth.
I think so much of this is how I think we, and I talk about the teachers, but just the caretakers, right? The adults, we as a society, if we think of sort of self-love and self-esteem kind of societal impact, I do think this is something where we can really play a role in just not only with our, if we have children, our direct youth, but just youth in general, right? Modeling is so important. And that doesn't have to necessarily, I think someone had said, like, what if you didn't have unconditional love growing up? I think it's not something that's just coming from a caretaker. It can come from, your best friend's mother, or your teacher that you had in third grade, or even your ongoing, but that a parent, an adult figure that shows love towards you, but also shows love towards themselves, right? So being, thoughtful and compassionate as an individual towards others, and showing that in different ways, right? That's just even, we think about like when, just even thinking about when COVID first happened, and sort of being thoughtful of thy neighbor, right? Like that, everybody was feeling so helpless, and it's recognizing that, maybe one of your neighbors is elderly and is struggling, like being able to, check in on them, or making sure people are okay in a safe way. And I think that's something that was really threatened early on, was some of those ways that we were so used to demonstrating self-love and self-esteem, and how we were compassionate towards others so that we could be compassionate towards ourselves. Some of that was really, I think, on shaky ground, because we were all in the, amidst of fear of our own safety and our own life.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're making me think too about, oh, sorry, Aija, real quick, you're making me think about cultural standards, and the, in some cultures, just the importance of helping other people, and how that can be very, very important to how you view yourself and your own self-love. But go ahead, Aija, I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, I want to just connect this actually to bullying, because in my experience, what I've seen is that a lot of times when there is a lack of self-love and a lack of self-esteem, it directly fuels bullying. In my experience, when I began getting bullied, I would come to school in 3rd grade and my classmates would tell me to kill myself. They would tell me my life wasn't worth anything every single day, over and over. I, as a person, turned that inwards. But what I did notice through a lot of my work over the past few years is that a lot of the people that were experiencing similar bullying turned it outwards on other students. And so obviously it just perpetuates this cycle. I did have one teacher who changed my life. And to just add to what both of you said, she would talk about herself and her experiences in life, whether it had anything to do with bullying or not, way that was much more positive than I was used to, but not in a toxic way or anything, just in a broader sense, that made me look at my experiences and what I was dealing with at the time differently. But on top of that, just having this person there that was willing to listen to me and also help me come up with a plan as to how to ask for help, because I was really, really struggling with some mental health issues at the time. That was, I can't even tell you how life-changing that was. And so when I go into schools now and I speak to young people, I always talk about creating a top 5 list of adults in your life that you can go to. And sometimes nothing will come of the first conversation or the second or even the third, but to continue advocating for yourself and finding those people, because I think that they can truly save lives and they're all around, and sometimes it's just hard to ask.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so for youth, it's about, as you're saying, like identifying those people. And then for adults, it's about helping youth identify those people. So something, yeah, that works at any age for sure. Yeah. Or is helpful at any age. Yes, I'm mindful of time too, but I want to talk specifically about, and I'm seeing some questions in the Q&A, and we are going to leave time for Q&A as well. But this kind of hits on something that we're talking about, but I want to like directly ask about like specific tips, specific tools for supporting youth around self-love. Like what can actually be done? You know, we've talked about modeling, we've talked about this a little bit, red flags. So once we see these red flags, you know, one thing I'm thinking about is how good it feels to do something that you enjoy. And Aija, I know you've talked about your really lovely quote that I like a lot. You've said, doing what brings you joy is the purest form of self-love. And so I think about, you know, adults and how we can help youth find what brings them joy. And that can be a very kind of concrete way of like actually sitting down with an adolescent, sitting down with a child, similar to your top 5, Aija, the top 5 adults in your life. What are the top 5 things that you just like doing? And how can you do more of those things? So, you know, that's one idea I have around like specific tips and ideas for like really sitting down with youth and fostering self-love. But Dr. Patel-Dunn and Aija would love to hear some more before we move to Q&A.
I think that I think when I was going through this period in my life, writing was something that I did for fun, and I think it saved my life, and it was truly that outlet that I needed. And so I definitely feel very strongly about this, and I think that having adults around that encourage young people to try different things that could be, you know, accessing that part of themselves that gives them some sense of worth and purpose. Like I remember I won a writing competition that the teachers in my life told me to enter when I was in high school and going through a really hard time. And this writing competition, for the first time in my life, I felt like, oh wow, I have a purpose on this planet. Because I was going through this really tough time, and this thing that I loved and this thing that people thought that I could do well at really added to that and helped with my self-esteem and my self-love. And that was because of the adults in my life that encouraged me to do this, even though I had no prior experience and didn't really know what I was doing. So I think, just as you said, that encouragement and listening and not judging and just being kind of that support system, mentor figure, for whatever it is that a young person is interested in exploring, I think that can be a truly life-changing moment for young people struggling.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Aija. What about you, Dr. Patel-Dunn? I'm going to throw it to you.
Yeah, no, and I think about So recognizing in our youth, especially our teenagers, this could change every day too, right? I think about like what's something that gives you joy one day. Sometimes as the parent, so in my parent hat, I think, this was something you loved today, but it may change tomorrow. So I think of just the tip of kind of listening, right, of us as from the adult role of like helping kids, our youth, and just listening, that sometimes they just need someone to really listen. And that's maybe not even just with your ears, but, with all your senses of kind of picking up on how their body language is, thinking about that. But I think about in fostering this, really encouraging us to share what we love, so that there may be things that our youth don't know, right? Like I think about depending on culture, depending on about how they're raised or what they are known to, they may not know or enjoy, going out and hiking or, different kinds of outdoor activities, exposing them to new things. And I think that that's something that's so important for us. But also remembering too, that sometimes there are things, especially in adversity, where youth may go back to comforts of when they were in younger ages. And so sometimes that's something that's really important and can be comforting and helpful too, I just like reading together or, watching a movie together as a family, or even going back to reading out loud. I think of things, just little things that were comforting. And I think structure too. That's something I think we forget about with that. I think youth appreciate the structure, and knowing they have someone who may help them figure out what's right and wrong, and what the rules are, so to speak. And those are different, but I think that that's something that can be really comforting and supporting to our youth.
You're making me think about how self-love is really developed in community and kind of in the context of other people as well, right? Like self-love, it's not developed in a vacuum necessarily. It is absolutely possible to cultivate and develop self-love on your own. But it doesn't have to be. It really can be developed in kind of connection with other people, and this idea of the importance of listening to youth, supporting youth, basically letting them know that they are loved and they're supported. That's a mechanism for them to then acknowledge, oh, I'm worthy of love. And that knowing that you're worthy of love, then boosts your self-love. So I really appreciate how you both are framing this kind of around the importance of support, connection, belonging with other people and community. I think that's so important. We have a ton of questions in the Q&A box. I wish we had more time to get to them all, but I did want to highlight some of them. Someone asked about, and I'm seeing, by the way, a lot of questions about resources. I'll note this at the end as well, but we have at the Mental Health Coalition, we have a roadmap to self-love that is available in the chat. It's on our website. It's a free, jargon-free resource to understanding what self-love is, what it's not, roadblocks to self-love, and can be a really useful tool for yourself. And then also for supporting youth as well. I think a major part of self-love is kind of education and understanding what it is, what it looks like, and how to develop it. So you can go to that resource, absolutely. And then we also at the Mental Health Coalition have a roadmap to mental health itself. So it's a jargon-free kind of primer on mental health. And, we've been talking all about self-love and self-esteem. And Aija, a lot of what you said, it was really clear on how this overlaps with mental health. And so even understanding what mental health is, what it looks like in itself, is kind of an avenue to building self-love. So all that being said, one of the questions I wanted to address is actually a few people asked about, like, what if you're in survival mode? What if kind of basic needs are hard, it's hard for them to be met? Kind of then what when it comes to self-love? How can self-love be addressed when youth are dealing with, some very fundamental, basic, like survival mode needs? This is for either one of you.
Yeah, I can start just with and thinking about, just going back to even food, clothing, and shelter, right? Like that the basic needs of our youth that may be struggling for just even having that. I think that that's something that is so important to, it's like your basic needs. And I think this is where basic needs change depending on, where you are, how many caretakers do you live with, both parents, do you what kind of situation is your home life, and then even your schooling. But I think that it's so important for us to, I think this is where as a society really making sure that we're supporting one another and helping develop, just even making sure that our youth have that's such an important part or critical part of development is feeling, what is sort of like food is love. I think of that as such a psychological term. I think you may appreciate that, Dr. Torres-Mackie, but, even just that sometimes food is love, right? That's what just making sure that we're helping provide for our youth in a food, clothing, shelter way. And one thing I just forgot in that prior question that I wanted to make note of course, as a psychiatrist is some things too for our youth is if we're concerned at all, it's so easy to, reach out and get help. And that sometimes just having a licensed mental health professional, clinician for our youth to speak to, that might be something that's very compassionate for us to do in making sure that, whether that's the school counselor or maybe somebody outside of school, but that, not to hesitate to make sure that we're getting our youth the mental health, sort of preventative mental health. Sometimes I think of it as a way of just helping and making sure things don't get worse.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Aija, there's a question here that I wanted to throw to you before we run out of time. Someone asked about engaging a teen who's in denial about mental health struggles and how social media plays a role in this. So I wondered, if you had any thoughts about addressing that.
Yeah. Well, I'll start off by saying I was in denial with my mental health struggles when I was going through it. And I think part of that was that it was too painful and too terrifying to admit it to myself during that time. And I was just trying to get through the school day and like do the bare minimum in school and not deal with anything else. Things that made it worse, I would say, is that sometimes this is out of good intentions, but sometimes I think that when a young person is struggling with this type of thing, with mental health, and adults, whether in the school or at home, are very much kind of like putting their opinion and views on them. It's like, this is what you have to do and this is how we're going to tackle it, without giving the space for the young person to kind of approach that conversation. I think that can help, or that can make a young person shut down even more. And I say this because when I was going through it, everything feels like it's out of your control. The way that you feel about yourself, what's going on in your head, if you're dealing with bullying, all of that. And so when I had people kind of come to me with their views and their answers and their solutions without really listening, even though it was well-intentioned, it shut me down completely because it was just too much. So I like to look at it as like chipping away at a wall, because a lot of times I think young people dealing with this type of thing do build a wall, and having constant conversation, questions that are not immediately getting to the root, but kind of chipping away. Like when I'm talking with parents of like middle schoolers, asking questions like, who did you sit with at lunch? And did you sit with them the whole time? Did they get up and leave? Who did you play with during recess? Do you have a play date coming up that you want to go to? Like things like that, to try to see who they're hanging out with and notice the signs if it's less people, different people, if their answers are giving you signals that something is up. And so I think those things can begin to chip away at that wall, and the same with mental health. And I forgot the part about social media that you brought up.
social media contributing to mental health struggles and being in denial of that?
Yeah, I think that that it's so hard to separate a person today from social media because it just is such a big part of their life. Um, but maybe encouraging at like dinner, you know, we don't have our phone when we eat dinner together, or maybe we go on a walk on the weekend, or like do something where you're kind of encouraging a space where that isn't there, and asking them how they feel during that period when they are a little bit removed from it. And just having conversations, even bringing up statistics maybe of like what it can do to a young person's brain that might be struggling already with mental health, being too much on it, or looking at the wrong accounts and the wrong content. I think that there's no easy solution, but it's like a constant conversation of trying to figure out how to chip away at that wall.
Absolutely. Yes, I love that. And we at the Mental Health Coalition, we're always talking about talking. We're talking about the importance of dialogue, discussing mental health in effort to destigmatize and in effort to, help people get the support that they need. Very briefly, I saw an important question in the chat that I wanted to address. I'll do it briefly, and then I want to move to something very special before we sign off. But somebody asked about whether or not we should address suicide with youth, even if they don't know somebody who has died by suicide. So my thoughts on this are as follows. We know from research that discussing suicide does not increase the likelihood of someone attempting suicide. That's a common misconception, a common fear in should I be talking about suicide or not? And like I said, what we do know though is that talking about mental health struggles, talking about things like suicide is crucial to addressing mental health struggles and to decreasing stigma so that more people have more of a chance to get support that they need. So I did want to briefly touch on that question, and we are going to move into something very special. I'm sorry that we couldn't answer everybody's questions, but before we end today's session, we are going to hear some spoken word from Aija. Go ahead, Aija.
Okay, so this piece is called Dear Me. It's a spoken word poem that I wrote as kind of a letter to myself around self-love. So I thought it'd be perfect to share with all of you today. So here we go. I might glance down at my paper because it's been a bit since I read it. Dear me, I used to beat you up because I believed if I was the meanest I could be to me, no one else could hurt me. I called that strength, but really it was fear. I couldn't stop hearing the words my bullies used to call me. I couldn't stop hearing them because I believed them. And so I took on that role, the biggest bully I could be, but to myself. I didn't realize that I hold the key to that level of cruelty. The way I speak to myself grows like a weed or a rose from the soil made of how I feel about myself. When I looked in the mirror, I used to wince, but now I wink. I would tell myself, I love myself so much that I don't need to eat that meal. It's called discipline, another word for looking in the mirror and seeing a girl that was never thin enough, that didn't deserve dessert. Insert inspirational phrase about discipline and bullshit ways to sculpt a body that's been sculpted enough. Dear me, you are enough. You have always been enough. Dear everyone, when you speak to yourself, do you talk to yourself like you are a friend or a bully? Because when you speak to yourself as the bully, you are teaching yourself to accept cruelty. That cruelty is good and safe. You are teaching yourself that your safe place is one of pain. Be gentle with your heart. Be gentle with your body. Nothing in life is guaranteed except the guarantee that the longest relationship you will ever have is with yourself. Thank you.
Thank you, Aija. That was beautiful and very powerful. So we will end there. Thank you all so much for joining us today. There are some resources we wanted to share. They are available in the chat, but we wanted to make sure that you all visit Mental Health Coalition's Roadmap to Self-Love, our Mental Health Coalition resource library as well. Also, Aija Mayrock's one-to-one that is available on the Mental Health Coalition Instagram page, as well as our library of one-to-ones there as well. Lastly, in celebration of self-love, at the Mental Health Coalition, we launched a TikTok challenge where people everywhere are encouraged to record what they love about themselves. I know it's really hard, it's challenging, but that's exactly the point. So we encourage you all to participate, share what you love about yourself. First, head over to the Mental Health Coalition TikTok, and then you can respond to that. We'd love to see your responses. So with that, thank you, Dr. Patel-Dunn. Thank you, Aija. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Hopefully we can all go engage in some self-care activity in order to boost our self-love. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.